You're listening to the Sales Today podcast, and I'm your host, Fred Copestake. On this podcast, we explore how sales professionals can develop a more modern approach to selling, the application of virtual and hybrid selling techniques, how to create meaningful business relationships, and much more. And welcome to this episode of the Sales Today podcast, one of the special Selling in the Gulf mini-series episodes, where I'm delighted to be joined by Selch. Now, Zach has actually worked in 99 countries more than me, which takes it up to an incredible 136 countries you worked in, Zach. Is that correct?
Yeah. I've sold to, well, it was actually 135, but I've sold to and gotten purchase orders from 135 countries.
What that one that you didn't get one in, I probably should do a whole episode on that and what went wrong. But of those, I know you've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I mean, you're an expert in helping companies open up new markets. You've written a book on this stuff, global sales.
Yes.
So yeah, particularly this is for us to talk about the Gulf region. So, I mean, yeah, just give us a little bit of background. What are some of the big things you've done in the Gulf? Yeah, there've been an
Boy, so I've sold pretty much to all the different governments in the Gulf, and I've sold to a lot of the big corporate. I mean, when you're dealing with the Gulf, a lot of the purchasing is government, right? Because you have the government funds, the family funds, the royal funds, and they own a lot of business and they drive a lot of business. Then you also have corporations that are both local as well as, you see in like Qatar and the Emirates, you have a lot of headquarters for multinationals that are serving EMEA now, especially now more and more you're getting headquarters in Dubai for EMEA. And I've sold to a lot of those companies, if not all of the major ones over the years. Going back, nowadays, a lot of people talk about working with Saudis, but they're not really working with Saudis. They're working with, Egyptians or Palestinians who live in Saudi Arabia. I remember dealing with people whose, grandfather lived in their yard in a tent because they were original Bedouins. And it wasn't uncommon 30 years ago for people to have a really nice house, but they'd have a tent in the yard because there were family members who still like living in tents, right? So, I've been doing this for quite some time.
Well, I was going to be too. I didn't want to mention that. I didn't want to say have experience in it, but no, I mean, you must have seen so many of the changes and kind of got.
Oh, yeah. I also like to
Fascinating.
say, like when I started to come to Dubai, the biggest buildings in Dubai were still like 12 stories tall, right? And Sheikh Zayed Road, which is the main road that everybody goes along, was really just like two lanes with, short buildings on either side. And there used to be a camel racing track where, not that far from where the convention center is now, right? And all of that's changed over the years. You see fantastic growth in that region, not just serving. I mean, it used to be okay. We were trying to sell to the Gulf to serve the millions of people who lived in the Gulf. But nowadays, a lot of the business that goes through the Gulf is actually, there are headquarters there that are serving Africa, they're serving South Asia, they're serving, Eastern Europe, all these places, right? But the Gulf has become a fantastic business hub. And it's also one of the, depending on where, the Emirates, especially Emirates and Qatar, are real meritocracies where you're getting immigrants from all over the world. And they're very, very diverse communities. So it's quite interesting.
It's really interesting. Hence this whole podcast and this series. So
Right.
when we think about selling in the region, then, I mean, and again, you've sold all over. We talk quite a lot about sales and sales in
Right.
general, but what's unique about this particular area, would you say?
Well, so there are two things I like to say when you're dealing with international sales. There are two things one is the mechanics of sales. And what do I mean by the mechanics of sales? If you're selling somebody, you're selling a widget or a machine in Ohio to somebody else, where it transfers ownership, how you get paid, all that stuff is pretty simple, right? And as you deal internationally, it becomes more complicated because where does ownership transfer? Who owns it? Who insures it? How do you get paid? How does the money transfer, etc.? Now, when you get into the Gulf, there are still a lot of mechanics of trade issues that are more complicated than virtually any place else in the world. There's paperwork requirements, there's legalization requirements. up until a couple of years ago, and I'm not saying it's stopped now, but I think it's slowed down a little bit. Any type of legal document, any agreement, anything like that, you have to get legalized through the Saudi embassy or through the local embassy. And there'd be a whole process for that. And there might be 5 or 6 different steps for that, right? So if you were dealing with a distributor in Saudi Arabia, you might have to legalize the agreement, and it might cost you $4 or $5,000 to legalize that agreement and take you a few months worth of work, right? Theoretically, you should get all those invoices legalized, right? That was the law. So you were dealing, if you bypassed that, you might be breaking, essentially not, you didn't have legal protection for your invoices and for your other paperwork. So there was stuff like that that people were doing. So the mechanics can be very, you might have to have a certificate of origin saying that this was more than 50% manufactured in the UK or the United States. And you'd have to find who would issue that to you. And then you'd have to get that legalized. Lots and lots of stuff like that. So that's one thing. And then on the other side of that was the cultural side. So every time we deal internationally, we're dealing with different cultures. But when you deal with the Gulf, like for instance, let's say you're selling to the Ministry of Health of Saudi Arabia, you might be dealing with a Saudi Arabian, right? Which is one culture. And then you might be dealing with a Lebanese person and a Palestinian, which are two very different cultures from Saudi Arabia. From the side, if we're Anglo-Saxons, we're saying, well, they're Arabs, but they're very different business cultures, right? And now you're dealing with multiple cultures. Now you might be dealing with an Indian as well, right? You might be dealing with a Pakistani, and it's throwing more and more different cultures into this mix. And you might find yourself, there are very few other places in the world where you go in, you're doing an enterprise sale, you're going into a committee of 5 or 6 people, and every one of them comes from a different culture, right? And there are very few places in the world where you're facing that day after day, which you do face in the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, places like that, right? So there are lots of different things. And you might be dealing with very long, deep cultural traditions and histories, right? It could be you work with one distributor and his family has a beef with the people who are working at a hospital, right? And you don't know about this, right? But everybody else knows about it because this is sort of a story that's been going on for a while, and they don't do business together. There's stuff like that going on. So the cultural aspect and the mechanics of trade aspect. Now, that said, like I said, I've done hundreds of millions of dollars worth of business in the Gulf, right? It's worth it. It's just a little bit of a struggle. You got to put some effort into it.
So, so put some effort into it, and I'm guessing adaptations. So, thinking about a salesperson. So again, I know you've trained sales teams. You've not only done
Right.
this yourself, you've set up teams to do it. And again, they're probably culturally diverse teams.
Right.
What are the best salespeople doing? How are they adapting to be successful in that environment?
So first of all, I'd say you want to really get a good feel. The best salespeople who are working in these type of environments are culturally adaptive, right? They are listening to these things. They're paying attention to what's going on culturally, and they're willing to learn. I've read dozens of books about Islam over the years. For instance, I've taken college courses in Islam, and I've taken, non-college courses on Islam, right? So you want to understand this. You want to have a good feel for the people you're dealing with. You don't necessarily have to have the language. Having 20 or 50 or 100 words of Arabic is fantastic, but nobody really expects you. And the bottom line is Arabic isn't necessarily the language of business in the Gulf today, right? Because there are so many foreigners. But understanding understanding the religions, understanding the culture, reading a little bit about the culture, those type of things, just being very, very, I would say, careful. And like somebody once said to me, never extend your hand to a woman before she extends it to you, right? Just little things like that that are just to be on the safe side type of thing, right? Because follow other people's cues, get a feel, because you're going to work. There are women in the workforce in the Gulf, right? There are Muslim women in the work. There are religious Muslim women in the Gulf force. And maybe they're going to reach out and shake your hand, but let them do it first, right? Just be ready to adapt. If something seems like somebody is leading in a different direction, like for instance, one of the big things with most Arab cultures is the language is very contextual. What does that mean? Americans say what we mean. Germans say what we mean, right? Arabs don't necessarily say it because they think you understand. So I have a very good friend who used to work for me, very good guy. And quite often I would say to him, Ahmed, I'm really sorry. I need you to spell that out for me like I'm a little kid. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me something. You are sure I understand. I don't understand. I need you to spell this out for me. Right. So you're very often dealing with that kind of stuff and you have to try and pick that up as well as you possibly can. Right.
So yeah, I mean, just being super adaptive, just aware, really aware, I think is what you're saying. That's what I found. It's just
Right.
picking up on things, reading the cues, not just steaming and going, well, I have my way. It's worked
Right.
in
Oh,
Argentina, it's worked in the UK, it's worked in wherever. It's like, well, good for you, but here,
and here it's
flex,
never going to
flex,
work.
flex, flex.
And people will people will pay top dollar in the Gulf, right? They won't try and push you down and kill you on the negotiations. They'll be good clients, but they want you to do things their way. And so it pays off to you to be willing to adapt and do things their way. It's very important, right?
So
Mhm.
if you can show early on that you are adaptive, that's a good move. He said, look, the whole language, you don't need to be fluent Arabic, but if you know hellos and a couple of greetings and some of those things, which shows, hey, you've made an effort immediately.
Oh, yeah.
That's going to stand you in
Look,
good stead.
exactly. Here's the deal, right? So, for instance, you do business. If you do business in England, I'm going to suggest that if you're not a drinker, right, you might have a problem. Because if you go into a pub and everybody else is buying beer and you were to say, huh, I've never had a beer before. What should I drink? You're going to attract attention to yourself and not positive attention, right? Now, everybody in the Gulf pretty much smokes water pipes and they do business over water pipes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. One of the phrases I know how to say in Arabic is I know how to say what type of water pipe I want. And it's a flavor that is common enough that everybody carries it, but it's not one of the three most common, right? So I go into a place, I sit down, I look at the guy and I say to him in Arabic, please bring me a water pipe with watermelon tobacco, right? And not watermelon, sweet melon tobacco. And everybody I'm doing business with looks at me as though I'm a talking monkey, right? They're like, Zach's Arabic is pretty good. Zach knows what he wants. Zach's had shisha before, right? Now it's almost a parlor trick, but it's the type of parlor trick that gets me rapport immediately with people, right? So, when you can do that kind of thing, now I understand the holidays really well, right? I know the differences between the holidays. So those type of things, those little details that let people know that you've done your homework, you've been here before, you know this stuff before, right? Is all very, very helpful. A lot of people come to the Gulf and they're like, okay, there's a lot of money in Saudi Arabia. They get there and they're like, oh boy, it's hot here. I don't like the food. I don't really like it very much. And they leave.
Yeah.
And so people are used to Americans and Brits and others coming once and never coming back, right? If you show them that you're in this for the long haul, that you're going to be a good partner. I have partners that I've been doing business with in the Gulf for close to 30 years, right? So for different businesses, I haven't stayed for this with the same company for that long. I have partners I've done business with, distribution partners I've done business with for four separate companies over the years, right? So, you can keep these relationships, but even if I'm not doing business with them, I'm staying friendly with them. I'm staying in good contact with them. So these long-term relationships are very, very important. And certainly the impression that you want a long-term relationship, right? These are the type of things that are going to help you sell more in the Middle East.
Wow. Brilliant stuff. Like, I mean, the partnership stuff, so we could talk about for hours. And actually, we did in a previous
Yeah.
podcast. Oh, I might put the link to that actually, because that whole partnering skills thing is ideal for that area. But just last up, then, just a quick one. If you could give some advice to yourself when you were starting out on all of this, oh, you've got that smile, which makes, oh God, I've got some good ones. If you give some advice to yourself, sort of, I don't know, 20-year-old, 25-year-old, when you're just starting on this whole, global mentor project.
I'll tell you what, I would look. So when I started doing business in the Gulf, the first time I was going out, I was 22 and I looked like I was about 16. And somebody I worked with said, grow a mustache. And I grew a mustache and it came in blonde. So I took Era and I made it dark brown just to make myself look a little bit older. Right. And I would say, if you're specifically saying, advice to a young person, youth is not your friend, right? You want to look mature. You want to look more respectable, right? Because people there aren't necessarily in the business of they don't want to necessarily do business with a hotshot 25-year-old, right? I would hit the library and learn as much as I can about the religion. I would learn as much as I can about how people into, I've spent I couldn't even quantify how many hours I've spent sitting on the floor, eating food with people, smoking water pipes with people, socializing. The business happens after you build this rapport, right? And if you can't build the rapport, nothing's moving. So, so you got to learn how to do that. And you got to be very comfortable with that, right?
Brilliant. Brilliant. Oh, I knew you'd have to tell me a story as well. And I've now got an image in my head. So, Zach, where can people get in touch with you? Because I know you've
Great.
got
So,
brilliant resources for this
question.
area and others. So,
Great.
yeah, where can we get in
Be
touch?
on LinkedIn as Zach Selch. I have a website called globalsalesmentor.com. On my website, I have country briefing documents for 118 countries. So if you're going to the Middle East and you want to read up on Qatar or the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, or for that matter, Azerbaijan or Armenia or Georgia or all those countries, I have 118 market briefing documents that go between 10 and 18 pages long. They're entirely free. You can download them, but you can also set a call with me and chat. What I do is I help international sales managers, international salespeople navigate through both the cultural side and the mechanical side of international business. And I essentially coach and train international sales managers to succeed better.
Brilliant. We'll put those links in the show notes so people can get those. Because those guides, I've had a look at those. They're very useful. They're very good.
Right.
Zach, thank you so much
Always a
for
pleasure, Brett.
jumping on and sharing that. As always, we could go on and go on, but I wanted to keep this short and punchy. You've given us some great stuff.
Thanks a lot, Fred.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to the Sales Today podcast with me, Fred Copestake. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe for more and leave a review. If you didn't like it, also leave a review. It's all about feedback and learning.